SEP Fanfic Readings presents Osculum Annuum by My Delphi. Chapter 11. Epilogue. June 20th, 2001. 3 years after the Second Wizarding War. Just open the door, please. Hermione tried to coax through the dove-gray wood, only to get a muffled huff in return. She bit her lip to suppress a smile as she stared fondly at the door leading to their ensuite. Draco, she murmured, but he merely huffed again. How was a witch to deal with the fragile ego of her husband? Draco, she repeated, softening her voice. Would you please let me in? No answer. With a small sigh, Hermione sank down and leaned her back against the door. A shiver raced down her spine, and she tugged her dressing gown tightly around her. The silky material was short enough that it offered very little coverage, but it was embedded with a warming charm and fought off the chill of the cool wooden flooring. You know that I don't mind, right? Her voice was soft. I think it's very flattering. Still no answer, but she knew that Draco was listening. I always thought that my first time would be awkward, and with someone I thought I loved, but who was just a crush. It would be painful and weird, and I would feel insecure and scared. I thought I would look back on it and maybe feel embarrassed, or try to forget about it. She continued while her hands fiddled with the soft hem of her gown, which barely reached past the clasps holding her stockings in place. But it won't be like that. I'm still nervous, but it's a good kind of nervous. I'm not scared, I'm not insecure. And I know I won't feel embarrassed when I think about it in a few years, because I know that you love me, and I know that I love you. Otherwise, I wouldn't have let you put that truly obscene ring on my finger. And it was obscene. The diamond was large enough that she could clobber a man with it. Should Voldemort somehow find a way to return again, that ring would be the best weapon the wizarding world had to offer. There was a slight shuffling on the other side of the door, so Hermione continued. I want to remember today for the rest of my life, and that includes tonight, because it will be one of the most beautiful memories. Not because Narcissa knows how to plan the perfect wedding, and not because all the people who are dearest to me were there, but because of you. Her heart still felt too big for her chest. It had ever since Draco had looked at her with barely hidden nervousness and read the vows he had taken months to write. And I know that you have this fear of disappointing me. And I know that you're convinced I will pack my things and run the moment you even make the tiniest mistake. But I won't. I chose you, with all your strengths and all your flaws, knowing about your past and what you had to do to survive, and how you grew as a person. I didn't run away when I discovered the dark mark on your arm, and I won't run away because of this either. A small chuckle escaped her. In case you haven't noticed, I'm rather stubborn, and very much in love with you. A beat of silence, and Hermione already thought she would spend the rest of her wedding night leaning against the ensuite door, while her husband hid away. And then the lock clicked, and she felt the door open behind her. Smiling softly, she turned around and came face to face with Draco. There was still a pink hue on his cheeks, and he still avoided her gaze, but he didn't look as ashamed anymore. Silently, he pulled her into his lap, and Hermione went willingly, burying her face in his neck and inhaling his scent. I wanted tonight to be good for you, he grumbled eventually, and Hermione hummed. It already is, and it will be, no matter what we do. We can stay here all night or go to bed and cuddle until we fall asleep. Or we can get dressed again and go for a walk. Maybe apparate to Paris. As long as it doesn't involve broomsticks, it will be amazing. Hermione promised, although she had no interest in leaving the beautiful chateau that had been a wedding gift from her parents-in-law. If she had it her way, they would spend their 3-week honeymoon in the south of France, either inside the castle's numerous bedrooms or on the elaborate grounds, and rarely get dressed. She had all she needed, after all. She had Draco. That's not what I meant. I wanted to satisfy you. Draco muttered petulantly, and Hermione wondered again when all aspects of his character had become so endearing to her. Even those parts she had thought to be obnoxious before she had fallen hopelessly in love with him. Draco, you're a very capable wizard with wicked fingers. They are more than enough to satisfy me. Hermione ran a hand over his bare shoulder, playing with the fine hairs at the nape of his neck. And tonight isn't just about me. I want it to be good for you, too. It was good the moment I saw what you were wearing underneath your dress. Merlin, it's positively indecent, he complained, but she could feel him smile against her skin. It's just a bra and knickers, and a garter belt with stockings. Besides, she teased softly, you're my husband now, aren't you? Means I can show it to you, can't I? His quiet chuckle let another shiver race down her spine as his breath caressed her. I guess it does, doesn't it? The arms around her tightened slightly. Patiently, Hermione waited and simply continued to play with his hair, giving him ample time to collect his thoughts and choose his words carefully. I love you. It was still so hard for him to say, making it all the more significant. I had a slight suspicion you might, when you asked me to marry you. She kissed his shoulder. And lucky for you, I love you too. Very much so. After another moment of silence, Draco gently pulled back so that he could look at her. The shame that had marred his face was almost gone, and instead he looked slightly reassured. Sure, he was still a hint of nervousness, but part of his confidence had returned. Thanks Cersei for his big ego. Maybe we can try again, he asked, and Hermione grinned. As often as you want, she promised, and pulled him into a kiss. July 31st, 2003. 5 years after the Second Wizarding War. Do we have to go? Draco grumbled from behind her, and Hermione smiled. He's my best friend, darling, she reminded him gently, glancing at him in the mirror of her vanity while she searched through the elaborate jewelry collection for a certain pair of earrings. Draco's love language was, amongst physical touch, getting her gifts, and that meant lots and lots of jewelry. And books. Enough that the manor library had to be expanded. Twice. He's your best friend, not mine, he scoffed, while he fiddled with his cufflinks. Hermione hummed skeptically, not bothering to hide her amused grin when he looked up and met her gaze in the reflection. What? Draco asked, now ignoring the sleeves of his shirt. Oh, nothing. I was just wondering why it was that my husband and my best friend meet up every Saturday to either play Quidditch or attend a game, and why my husband bought not only the Montrose Magpies, but also exclusive seats in every stadium in the British Isles, knowing that his wife has absolutely no interest in that blasted sport, and neither do those he openly admits are his friends. She piped, finally finding the set of earrings she had been looking for. Behind her, Draco scoffed. It's because Potter insists on having a job. It's not my fault that he's unavailable on any other day. The word job fell from his lips with such disdain that Hermione couldn't stifle her laughter. Oh, yes, the tragedy of going to work. Good thing you don't have to. She sighed pitifully and saw his eyes narrowed. My darling wife, he murmured then, while he approached her. A moment later, large hands settled on her waist, and his lips brushed against the sensitive spot behind her ear. You say that as if you don't have a job either. I may not work at the ministry anymore, but that doesn't mean, she began, and he chuckled. I'm only teasing you, my love. I admire your dedication to helping all sorts of unfortunate creatures, even if I don't enjoy watching you charm one ancient wizard after another into donating to the cause. Another kiss, a bit lower this time. My charming ancient wizards has been the main reason why the legislation of the protection of merpeople has been passed, and why the trade of alchemy eggs has finally been prohibited. She sighed while her husband continued to kiss down her neck, and then along her shoulder. It has, and I am very proud of you, my lovely wife, he murmured into her skin. If you are trying to distract me from attending Harry's birthday, Hermione began breathlessly, making him hum. Never, Draco whispered, while his hand slipped around her waist and up her side until he reached the swell of her breasts. She shuddered, and was tempted to give in to his skillful attempt of distracting her, but she forced herself not to. It's not working. If it isn't, then why is your voice so deliciously shaky? Draco wondered. And why, my dear? Can I see just how aroused you are? His thumb brushed over the front of her dress, right where she could see the slight outline of her nipple. Draco, you will not— A delicious shiver raced down her spine. We will not repeat what happened at Ron's birthday. This time, we're on time. And there won't be any suspicious stains. I'll make sure there won't be any stains, he promised. And we'll only be fashionably late. No. It sounded like a yes. No, her husband echoed, his thumb more insistent now. But you look so delicious in your dress. I thought about dropping to my knees and tasting you until you're left trembling ever since you asked me to zip it up for you. Oh, Merlin, how was she supposed to say no to that? Maybe, she began, and that was enough for him. Within the blink of an eye, he had turned her around on the small chair and dropped to his knees. One of her legs was thrown over his shoulder as he kissed along her thigh towards the center of her legs. His eyes were dark and glittering with hunger. They were, indeed, fashionably late to the party, this time without stains. August 6th, 2007. 9 years after the Second Wizarding War. Merlin! A high gasp escaped her as he sunk into her again. His answering groan sounded almost painful, although the expression on his handsome face was pure bliss. A thin layer of sweat covered him, dampening the bright strands of his hair and making them stick to his forehead. The hand grasping her leg tilted it higher, so his next thrust was even deeper, making it impossible for her to breathe for a moment. His pace was slow and steady, with a persistence that she couldn't think coherently. Draco. Her own fingers trembled where she was holding onto his forearms. I'm so close. Just a little bit longer, love. Just a little bit. He soothed, brushing another kiss against her lips, and that alone almost did it. Hermione could almost taste her orgasm, but she forced it back down with a stifled mewl. Still, she tethered precariously close to the edge, and knew that one more touch or one more thrust would do it. And he knew it as well, staring down at her with those dark, hungry eyes, and a smug smirk on those infuriatingly perfect lips. He had learned her every weakness, and discovered what turned her into a whimpering, panting mess within moments. And he played her body expertly, wringing orgasms from her until she couldn't remember her own name and was left quivering. But he wasn't the only one who would use their time together to explore and discover weaknesses. Hermione knew which buttons to press for him to spill into his trousers like an overeager schoolboy. A whispered word here, a gentle kiss there, and he was ready to drop to his knees and eat her out until she could do nothing but lay there and take it while he buried himself inside of her. Please, she whispered, wrapping her free leg around his hips to pull him closer. I want to feel you come inside of me. Her lips brushed against the shell of his ear as she clenched tightly around him. And that did it. A filthy moan was ripped from his throat, and suddenly there was a finger between her legs, brushing against her just so, and pushing her over the edge. Hermione came with a breathless gasp, her back arching and pressing against him. She could hear him grunt her name over the ringing in her ears, and was vaguely aware of his smooth and controlled thrusts turning erratic and instinctive until he was grinding against her while he spilled his seed inside of her. It took a while for her to return to earth, and when she did, it was to both of them panting as he rolled off of her. She followed him, tucking herself into his side and slinging her leg over his hips. Draco hissed and adjusted their position so she wasn't brushed against him, still sensitive, before he wrapped his arm around her and pulled her even closer, his broad hand cheekily cupping her breast. He muttered something under his breath, and one of the satin sheets covered their lower bodies as they basked in the afterglow. Her fingers followed the silvery lines of the scars on his chest, while his thumb teased her pebbled nipple. Clearly they weren't done for tonight. The thought awoke a memory that made her giggle under her breath, and she could feel how he shifted his head to look at her. What's so funny? He murmured curiously, and Hermione laughed again. I just remembered our first time, she began, and Draco groaned loudly, throwing his free arm over his face to hide it from her. Oh, don't be like that. She propped herself up on her elbow and tugged his arm away. Reluctantly, he let her, but didn't open his eyes. I was a 21-year-old virgin, and had been in love with you for over half a decade. And the way you looked in those silky underthings with the clasp, you can't hold it against me. He protested, and that made her laugh again. I thought it was very sweet, Hermione soothed as warmth blossomed inside her chest. It had also been very reassuring, because despite how long they had been together, she had still been nervous about it. And when he had lost it the moment she had removed her bra, those nerves were suddenly gone. And not only because he had hidden in the bathroom and it had taken her half an hour to coax him out again. Because that's what every man wants to hear on his wedding night. How sweet he is. Draco grouched, but a reluctant smile tugged on his lips as he opened his eyes again. I'm not the one who was insistent on doing things the proper pureblood way. Had we followed Muggle customs, we would have had ample opportunity to try beforehand. Hermione teased as she pressed another kiss to his chest. You say that as if you regret it. His hand had found its way into her hair and was playing with her long curls. Never. It was very romantic. She soothed immediately. A fond smile on her lips as she remembered the way their relationship had built after the war. It had been very romantic, and it even made it somewhat easy to confess to her parents that she was engaged to be married at the age of 21. Rather unusual for Muggles, but the average age for purebloods. Hermione hadn't regretted that decision even once in the 7 years before they had bound themselves to each other, in a ceremony that had been declared the wedding of the century by every British paper, and dominated the gossip section for no less than 8 months, which had caused Narcissa to float around the manor, radiating pride. Draco was her perfect match, as unlikely as it had seemed in the beginning, and they had gotten their happy end, although neither of them had dared to dream about it during the war. The odds had been stacked against them, and yet— Where did you go? Her husband asked quietly, and Hermione blinked as she returned to the here and now. I just remembered how likely it was that we would ever get to be happy together. There were so many things that could have gone wrong. We both could have died. And what if you had never kissed me in 3rd year? This might never have happened. Her voice was small as she thought about how different her life might have been, had it not been for that one moment. Would she still be as happy? Somehow she doubted it. I like to think we would have found each other somehow, Draco said softly, while he brushed a finger over her cheek. The expression in his eyes was heartbreakingly tender. Maybe a few years after the war at a ministry gala. I would have attended to improve the family image, and you would have been there as a guest of honor. We would have been alone, of course. Maybe you were hounded by an ex that couldn't let go while I tried to hide from a witch after breaking the betrothal contract put in place by my parents. We would have danced with each other to get rid of them, and you would have quickly fallen for my irresistible charm. Irresistible charm? She echoed incredulously. I rather think you would have been unable to resist whatever Muggle dress I had been wearing. Don't think for a moment that I'm not aware of your fetish for Muggle clothes. His chest rumbled as he laughed, and her lips stretched into a wide smile as well. You're entirely at fault for my appreciation of Muggle clothes, Draco murmured huskily. They are positively obscene. Hermione gasped as she felt him harden against her leg again. Heat began to pool in her stomach, and then his hand slipped between her legs and his thumb gently circled her clit with just enough pressure for her breath to hitch. Draco, she whimpered, shuddering at the positively cruel smirk on his face. But lucky for you, my love, I was an absolute prat and decided to steal your first kiss. He sounded so damn smug about it. That's nothing to be proud of, Hermione grouched, even as her voice hitched in the middle of a sentence. Merlin, he really had wickedly clever fingers. Oh, don't lie, you're very fond of it. One might even say you love it when I'm a prat. Draco teased, circling his thumb again with that stupidly smug smirk, and Hermione had it. Before he could react, she had already shifted and planted herself squarely on his lap. He was already hard again, and a slow roll of her hips ripped a groan from his throat. Do not, she repeated, grinding against him. Sweat stained his brow, and his breathing had begun to speed up, and yet he still found it in himself to tease her. Now, I thought we agreed. No lies in the bedroom. Draco panted, and her eyes narrowed. Prat? She accused, but only made him look even prouder of himself. Her husband agreed, while his hand spanned her waist to guide her movements, his thumbs brushing against her lower stomach. It made heat flare up in her lower abdomen, as a sudden thought crossed her mind. You know, Hermione began slowly, heart jumping in her chest, I talked to Severus yesterday. I thought we agreed not to mention other people in bed as well, especially not former professors, he said faux scoldingly as the head of his cock bumped against her clit, making both of them hiss. Would you listen to me for a moment? Her words would have sounded more convincing if she hadn't been panting and wanting nothing more than to let him slide into her again. Fine, but make it quick. I talked to Severus yesterday, and he decided that I can finally stop taking the potions. I'm fully cured of the curse. Dolohov's curse had lasted longer than any of them had anticipated. Even years after the Battle of the DOM, Hermione had needed to rely on carefully brewed potions. For the past 2 years, after an earlier and failed attempt to taper off her potions, they had tried again. Severus, who still hadn't decided if he hated it more when she called him by his first name, or Professor, had monitored her closely, and even occasionally returned to Hogwarts to confer with Madame Pomfrey. "I know. I was there," Draco agreed. He had been, at every examination, and during the 3 months she had been ordered strict bed rest after their attempt to taper her off had worsened her condition significantly. He had only left her when she had either begged him to give her a bit of space, or when his responsibilities had forced him. And then he asked his parents to keep an eye on her. Narcissa Malfoy was always pleasant company, and spent hours trying to coax a laugh out of Hermione by telling her the most obscure gossip, or bringing out some of the countless picture books documenting every step of Draco's childhood. Lucius Malfoy was equally pleasant company. Hermione had been cautious around her father-in-law, not quite sure just how much he and his views had truly changed. But eventually, she started to see the real him. An intelligent, caring man who put his wife and son above everything, and a great conversationalist who had a passion for debates. He had spent hours debating the finer points of wizarding laws with her, before moving on to structures of wizarding society in general, and finally, books they had both read. It had helped her realize that he truly accepted her, her Muggle heritage, and her views and values, even if they often differed from his own. Recently, he and his wife had started dropping hints about a certain topic. "And I was thinking," Hermione swallowed down the nerves that seemed to clog her throat. Draco moved her hips again, and this time he almost slipped inside. "That maybe we were ready for that next step, before your father gets another peacock." That made him pause. "First Severus, and now my father. Do you want us to have sex or not? Because I might not be able to perform if this conversation continues any longer. And if you mention Slughorn or Hagrid next, I might just ask for separate bedrooms." "Oh, will you just listen?" Hermione scowled and pushed his hands away so he would stop distracting her. With a melodramatic sigh, Draco held his hands up in surrender and sunk into the pillows. "Go on, then." He arched an eyebrow at her. "What is this next step, and how will it stop my father from purchasing another peacock, and thus not make Mother flee to France for a month again?" Hermione pursed her lips slightly, before she bit back a wicked smirk. He had teased her enough. Now it was her turn. "I was thinking that maybe we could try," she lowered her head until her lips were brushing against his ear, "for a baby." Underneath her, his body went rigid. When she pulled back to look at him, his face was blank and his eyes were wide. For a moment, he was just staring at her, and Hermione held her breath as she waited for his reaction. Then he blinked. "Really?" he breathed. "Yes," Hermione whispered in return. The hands on her waist were back. 1 second she was straddling his hips and looking down at him, and the next she was blinking up at the ceiling, and her husband kneeled between her legs. "Are you sure?" Draco asked again, his eyes bright and burning. "Yes," she nodded and laughed when he pulled her into a desperate kiss. "You better not make Weasley a godparent," he growled against her lips, fumbling between her legs, and oh. She sighed as she accepted him into her body. "I was thinking about naming Severus godfather." Her voice trembled, but she managed a small huff of laughter when her husband snorted. "You know that he will be abhorred and delighted at the same time, right?" he pointed out, kissing her again. "I'm counting on it." Another deep thrust. Suddenly, Draco stopped. Something flashed in his eyes, and the grin on his lips was truly wicked. "Potter should be the other godfather. Him and Ginny." Oh, he was devious. Now, think of your father's health, and of Severus. That might be too much for either of them to digest." She giggled, but he wasn't deterred. "Last Yule, father chatted quite pleasantly with Arthur, and even found it in himself to compliment Molly's cooking, without mother needing to step on his toes more than twice. I think he will survive," Draco insisted. "Instead of tormenting your father, why not just admit that Harry is your best friend?" Hermione asked exasperatedly, but her partner was almost as stubborn as her. "Because he isn't. I can't stand Potter." His hand grabbed her thigh and hitched her leg over his shoulder. The new angle was enough to make thinking impossible for a moment. When her brain worked again, she bit her lip and smiled up at him. So you want to? The contraception spell will still last a week, but afterwards... Hermione brushed a hand through his damp hair, but froze when she noticed the expression on his face. It was the way he had looked at her outside the room of requirement, when she had visited him at the manor, on the day of their wedding, and every morning when she woke up and found him watching her. Every day I think I can't possibly love you more, he murmured, and every day you prove me wrong. December 21st, 2010, 12 years after the Second Wizarding War. Even a decade after they had defeated Voldemort, Hermione still dreamed about it. Not about the battle, or the deaths, or the months in the forest. She dreamed about the locket. The countless luring dreams created by the Horcrux were still fresh on her mind, and at times her life with Draco seemed to overlap with what it had promised her. It was disconcerting, and as Hermione walked down the long hallway, the green evening dress adorned with countless emeralds swaying softly around her legs, she paused for a moment, leaning against a pillar to catch her breath. She slowly breathed in and out until her head stopped swimming. This is real. It is not a dream, she told herself sternly, anchoring herself by replaying all the unpleasant memories that the locket had so conveniently left out. Memories of her and Draco fighting when their tempers clashed. Memories of pure-blood events where more prejudiced families sneered at her until Draco's glower, Lucius's presence, or very few pointed comments from Narcissa sent them running. The memory of her in the hospital, pale and shaken and afraid, Draco holding her hand, his own fingers trembling as they waited for the healer to speak. The tears of relief when the blood had been nothing to worry about. Memories of Narcissa being unable to look at Hermione's growing stomach, hiding away in her private drawing room, because the memories of her own experiences were still too fresh. Pure-blood women often had problematic pregnancies. Draco hadn't been their only child by choice. They had tried and tried until Lucius had begged Narcissa to believe him that the child they had was more than enough. Memories of pain and fear and terror, and her buzzing thoughts calmed down, and the feeling of uneasiness slowly disappeared until her fingers stopped trembling. Everything was fine. It was real. They had gotten there happily ever after. Brushing a tear away, Hermione waited until her knees were no longer shaking, and she wasn't in danger of breaking an ankle due to her quite beautiful but definitely dangerous heels. She continued on her way, her steps slightly more hurried than they had been before. They were already late, and knowing her infatuated husband, he was nowhere near ready. And she was right. As Hermione stepped through the doors into her second favorite room in the manor, despite the abundance of Slytherin green and the silver snake mural that writhed on the walls and vaguely reminded her of the basilisk, she found her husband sprawled out on the rug. His suit was rumpled and his hair ruffled, but Hermione barely noticed it. Not when the smile on his face was blinding. Above him, squealing in delight and looking nowhere near ready, was their son. His blonde hair swayed softly as Draco bounced him in the air, before settling him down on his abdomen again. Again, he crowed, slapping her husband's chest with chubby hands until Draco complied and swung him up again, using the momentum and position to tickle him until the small child was howling with giggles. When you told me you would dress him, this wasn't what I thought you had in mind, Hermione said softly, feeling her heart flutter when Draco tilted his head back and gave her a crooked but unapologetic grin. Sorry, we got caught up in very serious business, he said solemnly as he got up and settled Scorpius on his hip. He didn't seem to mind that playtime was over, contentedly nuzzling against Draco's neck. I could see that. Clearly serious enough to leave our guest waiting. She agreed and settled in one of the dark armchairs, while she watched her husband whisk their child with him to grab the small robes they had ordered for tonight. Black with silver stitching and mirroring the ones Draco wore. Subtle constellations that had inspired their names and could be found on some nights when one was patient long enough. Watching Draco care for their child made something warm blossom in her chest. He always took the time to press kisses to Scorpius's fingers, his toes, his belly, or his cheeks, laughing and talking all the while. Love was etched into every corner of his face, and the fond smile on his lips didn't waver, even when Scorpius reached for the still-fading dark mark. A recent development. Only weeks ago, Draco would have flinched away, convinced touching it would sully their child. 2 minutes. That might be a new record for us. What do you think, Scorp? Draco wondered as he finished changing the little boy, who giggled in agreement. 2 minutes are still 2 minutes too long for Severus. Your father worries he might wear down the stone if he continues pacing like that, Hermione said, brushing a hand through her son's hair before she softly kissed his forehead. And Potter? Is he straining the floor as well, or can we refrain from calling in the stonemasons? Her husband asked nonchalantly, but it didn't fool her. Why both men still insisted that they weren't best friends, Hermione didn't know. She had long stopped asking and merely rolled her eyes when the wizards referred to each other by their last names. Merlin, Draco even called Ron Ronald instead of Weaselby. Harry has already arrived as well. He tried to convince Ginny that the weather was quite pleasant and that his new broom was excellent for playing during cold conditions. Hermione watched with amusement as Draco's eyes lit up. Well, as much as I hate to agree with Potter, this time he might even be right. The weather is certainly good enough to try out some brooms and maybe play a quick round. He nodded, ignoring the large snowflakes drifting past the window. If you so much as think about sneaking out to play Quidditch with him and Ron, there will only be one snitch, and it will be me telling your mother about your plans. She smiled sweetly while her husband paled. Narcissa Malfoy was a witch best not scorned, and sneaking away from one of her parties, especially one held in honor of her grandchild, was an offense like no other in the eyes of the poised society lady. Fine, Draco agreed with a sigh. What do you think, Scorp? Want to make Uncle Ronald cry instead? All you have to do is refuse to let him hold you and cling to Uncle Sev. Scorpius stared at his father with wide, attentive eyes, listening intently, although he probably understood only half of it. Stop conspiring with our child, Hermione decided to interfere regardless. Spoil sport. Her husband huffed, but lowered his head slightly to brush a kiss against her lips. But a very, very pretty spoil sport. Do you think my parents would mind watching Scorp for a moment? Or the night? Because this dress... Oh, hush! She tried to fight back the flush making her cheeks flame, but to no avail. He still made her blush like a schoolgirl. She quickly put her hands over Scorpius's ears before their son could overhear anything not appropriate for ears that tiny. I'm just being honest, my love, he murmured, his voice low enough to make goosebumps cover her skin. You look stunning. I can't decide what I prefer, this or those indecent little scraps of silk you call underwear. Tell me, my love, what are you wearing underneath this deliciously decadent dress? Wouldn't you like to know? Hermione tilted her head slightly. Maybe I will even let you find out, but only if you don't sneak off with Ron and Harry. Draco's eyes widened slightly before they darkened with desire. Whatever you want, my love, he breathed before his voice took on a more somber tone. Always. He sealed his promise with a kiss. March 12th, 2014. 16 years after the Second Wizarding War. I'm still surprised Mother and Father didn't send for us, her husband said while leafing through the Prophet. Well, Hermione hid her smug smile behind the rim of her teacup. Scorp has assured us that he is a big boy now, and he has always been rather brave, isn't he? She asked Draco, who nodded in agreement, still shuffling the newspaper around. One might say he's positively Gryffindor, she quipped, and Draco promptly dropped the Prophet onto his plate of scrambled eggs. Oh well, it was only the gossip section anyways. Besides, Hermione was far too distracted by the pair of delicate gold-rimmed glasses Draco had recently started wearing while reading. It had been a tedious process to get him to finally try them, but once Hermione had finally coaxed him into at least acquiring a pair, all it had taken was one night in which Hermione had slipped into her old school uniform for him to agree to wear them in private, with the condition she never tell Harry about it. They had added DA professor to their list of favorites, right next to Master of the Manor. A list that had enough privacy charms that even the Marauder's map seemed positively easy to reveal. There hasn't been a single Malfoy sorted into any other house than Slytherin since, her husband began imperiously, and Hermione laughed. Yes, and Salazar Slytherin himself founded the school. She finished his sentence with a dismissive wave of her hand. It was true. The odds were stacked against her, and her in-laws most certainly did everything in their power to ensure the Malfoy name would forever be linked with Slytherin. However, she hadn't given up hope yet. All those hand-knitted Weasley sweaters in Gryffindor red had to make an impact. You married into a family of proud Slytherins, my dear. You should have expected nothing less. Draco reminded her, as if she had somewhere forgotten in the last decade. The blasted napkins next to her cutlery were Slytherin green. Of course she wouldn't forget. Besides, it was only a small sleepover in the West Wing. That requires only modest amount of bravery. Most certainly nothing that might stray into Gryffindor territory. Oh, hush, Hermione said with a quick glance toward the doors leading into the conservatory. Scorp has been so excited about this little sleepover. It's a big step for him. Draco, who had gathered his newspaper up again, grumbled something intelligible from behind the slightly egg-stained pages. Hermione tilted her head slightly, observing her husband for a moment. There was a slight furrow between his brows, a telltale sign that something bothered him. His lips were pursed into a slight pout, and shadows lined his gray eyes. Perhaps last night's restlessness hadn't been related to the war after all. Could it be? Draco, love? She asked cautiously, sliding a hand across the table to cover his. It was just a sleepover. We won't be shipping him off to Hogwarts tomorrow. His gaze snapped to hers, and suddenly his calm mask slipped. But we will soon. He's already 5. Just a few more years and he'll spend most of the year away from home. And now that he has slept in the West Wing, he'll want to have a sleepover at the Potter house. Maybe even Ron's hazard of a home. Next thing we'll know, he'll want to stay away for an entire weekend. Draco's voice raised in alarm, as if the biggest horror he could imagine was their son leaving Malfoy Manor for more than a few hours. Hermione felt a wave of bittersweet happiness wash over her. She adored seeing their son grow up, but she dreaded the day that they would stay behind while they watched the Hogwarts Express disappear into the distance. It's scary, isn't it? Knowing they'll grow up eventually, she mumbled, her hand instinctively brushing against her still flat stomach. Her heart fluttered slightly, and she bit her lip to quell her nervousness. Maybe this was the right time to tell him. Terrifying, her husband agreed quietly. His fingers curled around hers. I don't know how my parents handled it. Hermione's pulse was racing as she brushed her thumb over the back of her husband's hand. Draco, there's something, she began, but was interrupted by a loud bang. The set of doors leading from the manor into the conservatory burst open, and their son appeared, followed by Hermione's in-laws. Scorp was sitting on a broomstick, his legs dangling precariously as he wobbled through the air. The smile on his face was so big and so filled with pride that it made Hermione's heart hurt with love. Closely behind him was Lucius Malfoy, who looked bizarrely dignified as he kept his hawk-like eyes on his grandson, prepared to catch him should he fall. When Scorpius's broom tipped, Lucius instinctively reached for him, but Scorp had inherited his father's aptitude for flying, and quickly soared higher again. They were tailed by Narcissa. The witch watched her husband and grandchild indulgently, clasping Scorp's little toy phoenix in her hands. The smile on her delicate face was warm and loving, soft in a way Hermione had never thought pure-blood women were willing to appear. Hermione leaned back in her chair as she watched Draco jump to his feet, eager to greet their son, and undoubtedly praise him for his display of flying skills, and promise him that they would flew to Diagon Alley right after breakfast so he could get 2 more brooms, and then flew to Grimmauld Place, or the Ministry, like the time Scorp had displayed first traces of magic, and Harry had been at work, where he would brag to Potter, who was definitely not his best friend, about what a Quidditch prodigy Scorp was. She smiled softly, caressing her stomach again. She could tell him later. They had all the time in the world. The end.